to come. Standing in front of him, Nyang Woogang fixed his gaze on him and asked with a smirk if he should test Yunsol's skills a little. Without hesitation, Nyang Woogang lunged forward, attacking with his weapon. Yunsol barely managed to evade, his movements clumsy and unrefined. Nyang Woogang laughed mockingly as he unleashed a barrage of strikes, shouting that dodging clumsily seemed to be all Yunsol was capable of. He taunted him further, claiming it was impressive he had lasted this long. From the side, one of the martial artists who stood beside Hyuk Ryonyung observed the fight carefully. At first glance, it looked as though Yunsol was helplessly being beaten down, but as the man narrowed his eyes, he noticed the truth. Yunsol twisted his body at the last moment of each strike, always avoiding a fatal blow. The observer clenched his fist tightly as realization struck him. Yunsol had memorized Nyang Woongang's attack patterns by examining the corpses left in his wake. It was an astonishing level of observation that bordered on genius. After enduring a flurry of attacks, Yunsol finally stopped to catch his breath. With sharp eyes, he muttered that Nyang Woongang's sword techniques were pathetic. Despite such a relentless barrage, all he had managed to do was slice Yunsol's flesh without inflicting a mortal wound. Nyang Woongang froze at his words, surprised at the audacity of the remark. The martial artist who was watching clenched his fist harder, realizing Yunsol was deliberately provoking his opponent. He knew Yunsol was evading skillfully, but landing a proper counterattack was an entirely different matter. With his frail body, a solid strike would be nearly impossible. Nyang Woonggang's grin widened at the provocation. He responded that he had originally planned to let Yunsol live a little longer, but since he wished to be arrogant, then perhaps he wanted to die quickly. He leapt forward with ferocity, screaming that he would grant Yunsol his wish. At the front, Yunsol braced himself for the decisive attack. His thoughts raced as he reminded himself that this chance would only come once. He recalled what he had discovered while examining the corpses of Nyang Woonggang's victims. Every finishing strike had been aimed directly at a vital point, most often the heart or the head. Whenever Nyang Woongang was driven by murderous intent, his blade inevitably targeted the opponent's upper body. If that was always the case, then Yunsol had found his opening. As Nyang Woongang swung his sword in a powerful horizontal arc, Yunsol ducked low, evading the blow. Nyang Woonggang's eyes widened slightly in surprise as he looked down at him. In that instant, Yunsol locked his gaze on his opponent, his short blade already aimed at his neck. He remembered the words of his grandfather, who had once told him that the Tiantu acupoint was difficult to train and toughen, even for a martial master. If a child struck it with full strength, even an adult could faint instantly. With sharp determination, Yunsol jolted upward, driving his short blade toward the vulnerable point. A spray of blood burst forth, splattering across the ground as the blade pierced Nyang Woonggang's neck. His body collapsed instantly, lifeless, crashing down at Yunsol's feet. Catching his breath and trembling from exhaustion, Yunsol stood as the only one remaining in the annex. In a faint, trembling voice, he whispered to himself, asking if it was finally over. At the side, the martial artist and Hyuk Ryonyung were both left in shock by the scene. The martial artist muttered in disbelief, calling it an unexpected variable. Hyuk Ryonyung admitted that he had some expectations since the sword art of Black Soul had been invoked, yet this outcome had surpassed what he had anticipated. He raised his voice and shouted to the hall that Bu Yunsol had passed the second trial. Yunsol stood frozen in the middle of the annex, struggling to process the outcome. His mind drifted, and suddenly he found himself face to face with the image of his grandfather. His grandfather's voice echoed as he called out for him, asking where Yunsol was. The younger Yunsol, in his memory, called back cheerfully, waving from behind with a bright smile and shouting that he was there. His grandfather, however, continued to mutter his name in confusion, insisting that he could not see him. The boyish Yunsol, still smiling, approached with eagerness and asked what he meant. But then, his expression shattered in horror. His grandfather turned around, his figure grotesque and lifeless. His eyes were gone, replaced by bloody hollows that dripped crimson. In a chilling voice, his grandfather declared that he could not see Yunsol's figure at all. Yunsol jolted awake with a gasp, his body trembling. He realized he had been dreaming. As he looked around, he noticed he was no longer in the annex. Instead, he was in a confined space surrounded by other young martial artists who glared at him with cold, unwelcoming eyes. The sound of ocean waves echoed faintly, and the steady creak of a ship traversing the sea reached his ears. Clutching his head, he muttered to himself in confusion, realizing it looked like the inside of a ship. He wondered aloud if he had fainted, acknowledging that he had indeed lost a great deal of blood. Examining his own body, he was startled to find that his grave injuries no longer caused him much pain. He questioned whether a renowned physician, befitting the Demon Palace, had been summoned to treat him. As his gaze shifted to the other young martial artists, he noticed that their bodies were well-trained and disciplined. Some of their faces even appeared strangely familiar. He realized they must have been the ones who had passed the first trial. The others smirked at him with contempt, their expressions filled with derision. Yunsol sighed and muttered to himself that such contemptuous gazes were to be expected. At that moment, a martial artist of the Demon Palace suddenly opened a latch from above. His commanding voice rang out as he ordered the group to disembark. He announced that they had arrived at the next trial area, Hell Island. As the ship docked at the island, the martial artist of the Demon Palace leapt down from the deck and landed on the pier with ease. He announced to the participants that this place was Hell Island. Turning his head back toward the ship, he ordered them to follow him. After some time, they arrived at a large mound riddled with caves. The martial artist pointed at the formation and declared that all of them would be sleeping there. He instructed them to stash away their previous clothes and weapons, and to come out dressed in the prepared garments with their new swords. He told them that they were free to choose whichever cave suited them best. As Yonsol walked among the others, he overheard the young martial artists chatting while picking their caves. One of them commented that the place seemed acceptable, noting that he had expected it to be humid but found it surprisingly comfortable. Another complained that the cave felt tight. Nearby, Yunsol stumbled across two participants in the midst of an argument. One was a female warrior who insisted that she had chosen the spot first. A male martial artist snapped back, saying it was nonsense, claiming he had been there before her, and that she could not simply reserve a place because she wanted to. Before the quarrel could escalate, another participant approached, intervening and urging them not to fight, pointing out that there were plenty of suitable caves to choose from. Yunsol walked past the squabble silently, his thoughts drifting as he observed the others. He realized that these people had no understanding of what had happened during the second trial. Their guards were lowered, and they carried themselves without caution. Among the ones who had passed the first trial, many wore expensive clothing, clearly indicating their origins from prestigious clans. He concluded that the purpose of the second trial had been to eliminate those who could not be killed otherwise. Suddenly a voice came from behind him. The martial artist of the Demon Palace had appeared silently at his back, asking if he had not chosen yet. Yunsol flinched at the sudden presence and turned his head slowly. The martial artist continued, noting that Yunsol had been sluggish since earlier and warning him that this was not the time to waste. He addressed him directly by name, telling him not to dilly-dally. Privately, the martial artist considered why Yunsol had caught his attention. It was his stare that first stood out, and now it was astonishing to see that he had survived. He wondered to himself what kind of choice Yunsol would make here. Out loud he urged him to hurry. Yunsol raised his hand and pointed toward a cave directly in front of him, saying that he would take that one. The martial artist gave him a disdainful look and remarked that of all places, Yunsol chosen a spot that suited his foul attire. He declared that it disgusted him, yet as he grinned faintly, his inner thoughts betrayed his true impression. To him, Bu Yunsol, truly a genius. The cave seemed small and filthy on the outside, but that was only its entrance. Inside, the space was wide enough to allow proper training, and the narrow opening served a natural protection against intruders. Most avoided it after seeing the unappealing entrance, but Yunsol had assessed it with remarkable thoroughness. The martial artist turned away and told him to get prepared. After some time, Yunsol emerged in his new clothes. The participants gathered together, and the martial artist from the Demon Palace raised his voice, explaining what awaited them. He declared that Hell Island housed 10 martial arts facilities. Within each building, one could learn the martial arts of the 10 demonic sects. The choice was theirs whether to study them all, or focus on a single path. They were also given freedom over their schedules. They could sleep, play, train alone, or learn martial arts, doing whatever they desired. As Yunsol listened to the instructions, he narrowed his eyes and muttered quietly to himself. Something about this seemed strange. The second trial had been designed as a living hell. There was no way the Demon Palace would now allow them to simply train in peace. Meanwhile, the other participants broke into chatter among themselves. One asked which martial art they should learn first. Another quickly answered that it was obviously the Fire Rain Sword Sect's techniques, since they were rumored to be the strongest. Excited voices urged each other to hurry. Yunsol watched them rushing toward the same direction and continued to think. He knew the Fire Rain Sword Sect was indeed reputed as the most powerful among the demonic sects. Their martial arts would certainly prove useful to anyone who could master them. Yet for him, it was different. He had never learned martial arts before, and he concluded that even if an art was incredible, he could manage without it. Instead of following the crowd, he turned in the opposite direction. After some time, he arrived at a small, shabby house. He stopped and examined it carefully, his thoughts circling. This was the Wandering Beast Pavilion. They had fallen so far in reputation that they barely remained among the 10 demonic sects. The only reason they were still recognized was because of their long history of producing some of the strongest martial masters of past generations. His grandfather had once spoken to him about them when telling stories of the Murim. Yuan-Sol resolved that this would be his path. Before he could finish his thought, the ground beneath him began to tremble. Suddenly, a head emerged from the earth, startling him. The man asked what it was that brought him here, and whether Yuan-Sol had come seeking to become one of the 10 demon masters. The figure was Sa Wu, the secret pavilion master of the Wandering Beast Pavilion. Yuan-Sol staggered at the sight of the head protruding from the ground. He went silent for a moment, then bowed respectfully and replied that he had come to learn the martial arts of the Wandering Beast Pavilion. Sa Wu's eyes scanned him from head to toe. After a pause, he told him not to hasten his own death and to leave. He had no intention of teaching martial arts, especially not to someone as frail as Yuan-Sol. As Sa Wu began to lower himself back into the ground, Yuan-Sol spoke out again, saying that he had heard that learning the martial arts of the Wandering Beast Pavilion granted the power to survive anything. Sa Wu paused, surprised by his words. He admitted that he was taken aback by Yuan-Sol's knowledge of arts that were soon to fade into obscurity, but even the greatest of geniuses had difficulty mastering them, he warned. Their training began with altering the body itself, and in Yuan-Sol's current physical state, he would not survive longer than a single day. He told him to understand this and leave. Instead of retreating, Yuan-Sol dropped to his knees and bowed deeply to the ground before him. Sa Wu asked what he was doing. Yuan-Sol responded with unwavering determination that since Sa Wu had agreed to teach him, he could not fail to pay his respects to his new master. Sa Wu froze for a moment and stared at him. Then he sighed, calling him a crazy brat. After a long pause, he conceded and said that he would teach him. However, he clarified that Yuan-Sol should not be confused about his reasons. He was teaching only because the Demon Palace had ordered it. Sa Wu pulled himself fully from the ground and introduced himself formally. He declared that he was Sa Wu, the master of the Wandering Beast Pavilion, and that from this moment on, Yuan-Sol was to call him Master Sa. Yuan-Sol bowed again and introduced himself as Bu Yuan-Sol. Sa Wu cut him off sharply, declaring that he was not Bu Yuan-Sol here, but only trainee number 1. The air shifted with an intimidating weight as Sa Wu extended his hand and pointed directly at him. He ordered that they begin immediately. Sa Wu moved without hesitation. He extended 2 fingers and pressed them under Yuan-Sol's eye. Instantly, Yuan-Sol's vision began to fade into darkness. Alarm spread across his face as he exclaimed in shock that he could no longer see anything. A calm yet chilling voice echoed in his ears. It was Sa Wu, who explained that there was no need to panic. He told Yuan-Sol that he had temporarily sealed his vision using the secret techniques of the Night Pavilion. This, he said, was a necessary step in order to begin learning the Wandering Beast Path, a fundamental martial technique of the Wandering Night Pavilion. Yuan-Sol, confused but curious, asked about the Wandering Beast Path. Sa Wu elaborated. The technique heightened the senses and granted reflexes akin to those of a beast. Unlike other martial arts, their methods changed drastically depending on the person learning them. Because of this, mastering the Wandering Beast Path was incredibly difficult, and over time, fewer and fewer dared to attempt it until it reached the point of near extinction. However, he explained that if one truly mastered it, they would obtain the instincts and senses of a wandering beast. Sa Wu smirked as he moved closer to Yuan-Sol. He added cruelly that most people died before ever reaching that point. Leaning in even nearer, he whispered that Yuan-Sol should be able to adjust to the loss of vision in about an hour, and that he would return at that time. Then he left. Left in silence, Yuan-Sol thought bitterly to himself. He had expected his other senses to sharpen after losing his sight, but he could not feel much change. He remembered Sa Wu had said it would take an hour, yet he decided that waiting would be too slow. He needed to adapt immediately. With determination, he began moving clumsily, stumbling and falling as he forced his body to adjust. He reminded himself that countless martial artists were competing to become one of the 10 demon masters. If he were ambushed in such a vulnerable state, he would not survive. He imagined an enemy attacking him from behind. Trying to visualize and respond, he fell again, muttering that without his vision, balance had become his most important foundation. He steadied himself and began training his movements in complete darkness. By nightfall, Sa Wu returned, yawning casually as he thought to himself that Yun-Sol was probably lost and helpless by now. However, what he saw froze him in his tracks. Yun-Sol was moving smoothly, his motions sharp and deliberate as if fighting an unseen opponent. Sa Wu narrowed his eyes. This was unusual. Most trainees waited passively for their other senses to compensate after losing vision, but Yun-Sol was wildly pushing forward, imagining a false enemy and forcing his body to adapt. Perhaps this was why he had adjusted so quickly. Sa Wu stepped forward and spoke aloud, acknowledging that Yun-Sol had indeed gotten used to the blindness. He then suddenly ordered him to evade his sword. Without warning, he swung his blade directly toward him. 3 days passed. Rain poured heavily, and Yun-Sol was thrown down onto the muddy ground, his body battered from constant training. He struggled to rise again. In front of him, Sa Wu stood calmly, holding his sword. In an instant, the master rushed forward and thrust the hilt into Yun-Sol's gut, forcing him back down. Looking down at the young disciple, Sa Wu reflected silently. By the 3rd day, most trainees questioned his methods or demanded explanations, yet this boy had not. He only endured. Out loud, Sa Wu asked why Yun-Sol never questioned anything, why he did not ask how to avoid attacks or demand theories behind the training. Yun-Sol lifted his head and answered with steady determination. He reminded Sa Wu that he had said the essence of the Wandering Night Pavilion's martial arts was to reach enlightenment through one's own discovery. Because of that, he believed there must be a reason behind Sa Wu's harsh methods, and so he endured without complaint. Sa Wu froze for a moment, surprised by the answer, before smirking. He admitted that Yun-Sol was right and declared that they would continue. Without hesitation, he leaped forward again to attack. At that moment, Yun-Sol felt something he had never experienced before. His senses surged. In his thoughts, he exclaimed that he could see it, not with his eyes, but with his instincts. He could feel the sword's path. It was faint and incomplete, but it was they. He resolved that if he could not evade, then he would block instead. He lifted his weapon and intercepted Sa Wu's strike. The impact was overwhelming, sending him staggering backward, but he had blocked it. Sa Wu's eyes widened in shock and disbelief. Inwardly, he was stunned. Yun-Sol had blocked his silent attack after only 3 days of training, something no one else had ever achieved. Yun-Sol, catching his breath, muttered to himself in frustration. He had managed to block, but it was not a clean defense. The force of the blow still overpowered him. Sa Wu suddenly tossed him a piece of bamboo and ordered him to drink from it. Yun-Sol caught it, nodded gratefully, and took a sip. The moment the liquid touched his tongue, his eyes widened in shock. It was not ordinary water. Energy surged through his veins, and he felt as if the blood he had lost from countless wounds was being restored. He whispered to himself in awe, questioning what it was. Watching him from the front, Sa Wu grinned widely to himself. He thought of the truth. The liquid was none other than the ultimate spring spiritual water, something he had treasured and saved his entire life. Yet giving it to Yun-Sol did not feel like a waste, for in that moment, he realized that he had met the kind of genius that appeared only once in a lifetime. Very disciple he had been waiting for all these years. Sa Wu and Yun-Sol continued their relentless training. At last, Yun-Sol was able to block Sa Wu's strike completely, his blade holding firm under the pressure. Sa Wu smirked at the sight, a flash of approval in his eyes, before shouting for him to try receiving the attack again. He swung once more, his sword flashing toward the disciple, but this time Yun-Sol dodged quickly. Sa Wu frowned and barked that it was not good enough. In an instant, Sa Wu vanished from his position and reappeared right behind Yun-Sol, his blade already descending. Startled, Yun-Sol twisted around and managed to block the sudden attack. His chest heaved as he gasped for breath, straining to steady himself. For a moment he wondered in silence if his master had finally stopped attacking. Without warning, Sa Wu burst into wild laughter, his voice echoing through the air. He shouted joyfully that what he had been searching for all this time had been right in front of him. With that, he lifted the seal from Yun-Sol's eyes. Vision returned to Yun-Sol in an instant, and he whispered in awe to himself that he could see again. Sa Wu's expression shifted to calm seriousness as he addressed him by name. Stepping forward, he placed both hands firmly on Yun-Sol's shoulders and spoke with excitement. He told him to abandon the idea of becoming one of the 10 demon masters. Instead, he urged him to become an official disciple of the Wandering Beast Pavilion. If he agreed, Sa Wu promised that within 10 years he would raise him into one of the 10 strongest martial masters within the entire demon faction. Yun-Sol remained silent, his gaze heavy as he lowered his head. In his thoughts, he admitted to himself that the promise was not an empty boast, Based on Sa Wu's strength and the training he had endured so far, he believed his master was telling the truth. Yet the memory of his grandfather's murderer weighed heavily on him. The killer was highly skilled, and just learning the martial arts of the Wandering Beast Pavilion would never be enough. He could not be satisfied with only that. After collecting his thoughts, Yun Sol raised his voice with conviction. He declared that he would still become a demon master. Sa Wu scoffed at the stubbornness. He told him to forget such an ambition if his reason was simply to learn the martial arts of the 10 demonic sects. Even the Grand Heavenly Demon Emperor, who was talented enough to create his own martial techniques, had not achieved such a thing. Sa Wu explained that every martial art was suited to a certain physique and type of energy. No matter how talented someone might be, they could only truly learn 2 or 3 martial arts at most. He emphasized that pursuing a single martial art with absolute dedication was the true path to becoming the strongest within the demonic faction. Despite the warning, Yun Sol bowed his head and offered an apology. Sa Wu stared at him for a long moment, then sighed heavily as he wondered silently if there was truly no way to change his disciple's mind. Finally, he turned away and conceded. He said that in that case, he would teach him a different martial art immediately. Yun Sol was surprised and questioned him, pointing out that he had only just learned the basics of the Wandering Beast Pavilion. Sa Wu explained that the martial arts of his pavilion were not passed on merely through memorized steps or written theories. Without warning, he lunged forward and attacked Yun Sol again. Though caught off guard, Yun Sol managed to block the strike firmly. Sa Wu smiled with satisfaction and told him that he had already been practicing the wild beast path of the pavilion. Yun Sol's thoughts raced. He realized then that every single sword strike Sa Wu had launched at him during training had been genuine forms of the wild beast path itself. Bowing again, he gave thanks aloud. Sa Wu dismissed the gratitude and reminded him that it had been the order of the Demon Palace. Yun Sol, however, reminded him that he had even given him precious elixirs. He swore that he would never forget such grace. Sa Wu shook his head and told him that he should forget it. When Yun Sol expressed confusion, Sa Wu explained that this was the nature of the Jiang Hu. Favors and grudges alike were best forgotten whenever possible. With respect, Yun Sol bowed deeply to the ground and said that he would take his leave. After a moment's silence, he turned and began walking away. Sa Wu stood watching him depart, murmuring under his breath. He wondered aloud where such a hidden dragon had come from, and foresaw that a bloody storm would soon sweep across Hell Island. As Yun Sol walked alone through the dense forest, his thoughts lingered on his training. He wondered if the reason he was sensing so much was because of the wild beast path. His senses were too sharp, and even when standing still, the overwhelming rawness of it drained him. He knew that unless he learned to control it, he would never be able to rest properly. He resolved to suppress his senses as much as possible from now on. He compared the process to stopping a falling droplet of water, and with that thought, he calmed himself. Opening a scroll, he studied it carefully. He muttered that the next step would not simply be continued training. The Demon Palace would not have sent them to Hell Island just for endless exercises. Time might already be running short. If that were the case, he had no other option but to seek out the founder of a demonic sect who had once rivaled even the Grand Heavenly Demon Emperor 700 years ago. Fire Rain Sword Emperor, Jia Huawun. He resolved that the Fire Rain Sword sect, the strongest sect in the demonic faction and the one Jia Huawun had founded, was now his only path forward. After some time, Yun Sol arrived before the Fire Rain Sword sect. Standing before the towering gates, he gazed at their grandeur and compared them silently to the Wandering Beast Pavilion's martial hall. In comparison, this place looked like a palace. He knocked firmly at the door, and it soon opened. A martial artist stepped out, one whom Yun Sol recognized as someone from the first and second trials. The man frowned in surprise and remarked that it was strange to have a visitor at such an hour. He then asked who Yun Sol might be. The martial artist's eyes fell on him in recognition. Yun Sol bowed respectfully and introduced himself. He declared that he had come to learn the martial arts of the Fire Rain Sword sect. Inwardly, he noted that this was clearly a martial master of the sect. The man turned his back and commanded him to follow. Together, they walked deeper into the massive hall. As they did, the martial artist explained that the sword arts of this sect were the most expansive of including demonic martial arts, and also the most time-consuming to master. Those who had entered earlier had already passed the elementary trial and moved on to the intermediate trial. He asked why Yun Sol had only arrived after half a month. Yun Sol answered honestly, saying that he had been training at the Wandering Beast Pavilion during that time. The martial artist turned to glance back at him and asked with suspicion if he had learned the wild beast path. Yunsol confirmed that he had. The man, still doubtful, thought silently to himself. He acknowledged that the boy was a genius, but it was impossible to master the wild beast path in only half a month. More likely, he assumed, Sa Wu had grown annoyed with him and dismissed him prematurely. Still, he accepted the situation. He finally turned fully around and introduced himself. He declared that his name was Jin Gok and that he was responsible for overseeing the beginner trial. He told Yunsol to call him instructor. He asked if Yunsol truly intended to learn the Fire Rain sword art, warning that it might be better for him to attempt a different trial. Yunsol bowed his head respectfully and expressed his gratitude for the concern, but with determination in his voice, he declared that he fully intended to study the sword arts of the Fire Rain sword sect. Jin Gok nodded once and lifted his foot. He stomped down on the floor with force, and the air shook with a resounding shockwave. A massive scroll materialized beside him, and he gestured toward it. He announced that it contained the introductory form and practical method of the Fire's 13 forms, instructing Yunsol to study it and train himself. Yunsol froze in confusion at his words. He hesitated for a moment, then raised his hand as he asked what he was supposed to do with it. Jin Gok frowned in disbelief, demanding what he meant. Surely, he asked, the boy was not claiming that he could not read a sword manual. Yunsol answered with honesty. He admitted that he could not. Jin Gok was stunned by his response, his eyes wide. Yunsol then added quietly that up until this very day, he had never once learned swordsmanship before arriving here. The admission left Jin Gok speechless. After a few moments, Jin Gok finally spoke, asking if Yunsol had truly never learned swordsmanship in his entire life. Yunsol admitted that he had not. Jin Gok reflected on this quietly. It was recorded that Yunsol had only ever relied on Fire Rain until now, and even during the second trial, he had not used a specific sword technique. Still, it troubled Jin Gok that Yunsol lacked even the most basic of skills, such as sword steps. Yet, on the other hand, he remembered the sharp observational skills and reactions Yunsol had demonstrated during the second trial, as well as the insight he had shown when choosing the cave dorm. If a blank canvas like him could display such qualities, Jin Gok wondered what level Yunsol might reach if he were properly taught. Speaking aloud again, Jin Gok asked if Yunsol could at least read. He then instructed him to read the manual. Yunsol read aloud a line that said, "Full body relaxation, softly flow into one." Jin Gok explained that full body relaxation meant to relax the body and use it flexibly when performing swordsmanship, with particular focus on relaxing the core and waist. Yunsol attempted the movement clumsily, asked if that was correct. Jin Gok was stunned that he had to teach such rudimentary basics in a place meant to determine the 10 demon masters. He walked over and adjusted Yunsol's posture himself, instructing him to stand properly once again. He reminded him that when the body was tense, the core was also tense, and stressed the importance of controlling the mind to relax and flow softly into one. Yunsol attempted the move once again. This time, his posture was correct, and Jin Gok was surprised to see that he understood immediately after being told only once. Smirking, Jin Gok said that his posture was sufficient and declared that he would now teach him the Fire Rain 13 forms immediately. From there, Jin Gok began instructing Yunsol with precision. He corrected his posture, stance, and movements sharply, observing him with strict focus. Before long, Yunsol was performing the technique smoothly on his own. Jin Gok's eyes widened, and a grin spread across his face as he thought to himself that his suspicions had been correct. This boy truly had talent. After watching for some time, Jin Gok gave the next instruction. He told Yunsol to imagine that there was an enemy in front of him and to use the Fire Rain 13 forms. Yunsol repeated the word enemy in uncertainty. Jin Gok confirmed it, explaining that this was the examination required to progress to the intermediate chamber. The test was to determine the sword intent contained within his basic moves. Lowering his gaze, Yunsol muttered that the exam had come sooner than he expected. He knew that this was his chance to prove himself. Sliding one foot into place, he took the stance of the Fire Rain 13 forms. In his mind, he envisioned an enemy that he absolutely had to defeat. A figure appeared in front of him, and he drew his sword, declaring silently that this was his enemy. He began with the first technique, Peerless Whirlwind, executing it with sharp focus. Jin Gok's eyes sharpened as he observed every movement. Yunsol then transitioned smoothly into the third technique, Foggy Drifting Clouds. At this sight, Jin Gok was shocked. He muttered under his breath that the technique should have been soft and spirited, akin to drifting clouds and spreading fog. Instead, Yunsol's execution was strangely sharp. Jingak wondered if Yunsol was consciously altering it. To alter the foundational moves of a sword technique handed down for generations was something only possible for a grandmaster. Yet these altered forms carried an undeniable killing intent, as though Yunsol was confronting the enemy who had slain his master or parents. For Jingak, it was astonishing to witness the swordsmanship of the Fire Rain sword sect, considered orthodox even among sword paths, being reshaped before his very eyes. He could not help but wonder what kind of life this boy had lived. Meanwhile, Yunsol himself noticed the strangeness in his movements. He realized that the flow at his fingertips was altering the sword paths on its own. He suspected that this might be due to the wild beast path. The more he practiced the Fire Rain 13 forms, the sharper the senses of the wild beast path became. He wanted to fuse the two completely, but if he did, it would no longer be the Fire Rain 13 forms. It would instead become an entirely new style of swordsmanship. He told himself he needed to return quickly to the original basics before losing the form completely. At that moment, however, his imagined opponent shifted into the figure of the man who had murdered his grandfather. His expression twisted with grief, and rage ignited inside him. Gritting his teeth, he charged forward and unleashed the 7th technique, overturning 4 Cs. Yet his imagined opponent only grinned and dodged the attack with ease. Yunsol noted with alarm that the figure was fast. He attacked again, but his enemy continued to evade every strike. Yunsol thought in shock that this figure was faster than anyone he had ever fought before. The enemy drew a sword and counterattacked. Yunsol barely managed to dodge. He muttered to himself that he could not give his opponent any space, and resolved to use the techniques he had left in one final barrage. Pouring all of his energy into his strikes, he unleashed a storm of attacks. Yet the figure continued to grin as it countered. Its blade flashed, and in one swift motion, it struck Yunsol, severing both his arms in the vision. Yunsol froze in shock, gasping for breath, before dropping his sword. On the sidelines, Jingak had been watching with sharp focus. He concluded that in the end, Yunsol had lost. Yet a smirk tugged at his lips as he spoke aloud, telling Yunsol that he had passed. Yunsol, still bent over as he caught his breath, looked up in confusion and asked for clarification. Jingak explained that the test of the elementary chamber was not about victory or defeat, but rather about demonstrating one's understanding of the sword and the execution of the Fire Rain 13 forms in a real combat scenario. He kicked up Yunsol's fallen sword, caught it, and handed it back to him. He told him that his display had been more than sufficient proof and that his execution of the Fire Rain 13 forms was incredible. With that, he instructed Yunsol to proceed to the intermediate chamber. Yunsol accepted the sword and muttered in his heart that Instructor Jingak must have found it troublesome to teach someone with no background in swordsmanship, yet he had guided him step by step with patience. Bowing respectfully, he expressed his gratitude. Jingak smiled and told him to continue working even harder from now on. His tone then shifted as he warned Yunsol that his sword carried a particularly strong killing intent, and that he must be careful not to be consumed by it. Yunsol lowered his gaze without responding. After a moment, he bowed once more and turned to leave. As he departed, Jingak thought to himself that it was indeed true. Yunsol had really mastered the wild beast path in just 2 weeks. Perhaps it was due to his astonishing learning speed. Regardless, he was advancing to the intermediate chamber far faster than anyone had expected. At first, Jingak had doubted whether he could make it that far at all, but now he was certain. The instructor of the intermediate chamber would surely become obsessed with Bu Yunsol in the end. When Yunsol opened the door to the intermediate chamber, the instructor and the other participants turned to glance at him. Without hesitation, the instructor spoke directly, telling him that he did not care who he was, but other spots had already been filled. He ordered him to leave immediately. This man was Chan Wungang, the intermediate trial instructor of the Fire Rain sword sect. Chan Wungang glared at Yunsol and spoke through clenched teeth. He remarked that Yunsol seemed to have passed through the elementary chamber by relying on fear alone. It had taken him more than 20 days just to learn the Fire Rain 13 forms. And with such limited talent, Chan Wungang claimed, he would only waste time by remaining in this chamber. Yunsol lowered his head respectfully and replied that his delay was because he had spent 2 weeks at the Wandering Beast Pavilion. Chan Wungang raised his brows and asked if that was the case, questioning whether it was not instead because he had been slow to learn the elementary teachings. Inwardly, he considered the matter carefully. The Wandering Beast Pavilion was infamous for its wild beast path, and he suspected that Yunsol might have attempted to learn it midway through his training. After a pause, Chan Wongang conceded and spoke aloud, granting Yunsol permission to take a seat since he had technically passed the elementary chamber's teachings. However, he added that he doubted how well Yunsol would be able to follow the next stage of training. Without wasting time, Chan Wongang resumed his instruction to the gathered participants. He explained that the Fire Rain Thundering Sword was a style built on rapid movements. If one lacked sufficient skill with the sword, they would end up hurting themselves. Like the Fire Rain 13 forms, this martial art was difficult to use in real combat, but even so, it was still considered basic. They were required to learn it as part of the process. He emphasized that their main goal would not be simply to win, but to sharpen their swordsmanship. Calling out a name, Chan Wongang ordered Byok Hansung to come forward and select an opponent for a duel. Byok Hansung stepped out with a confident grin and asked if he was free to choose anyone. When Chan Wongang confirmed this, Byok Hansung smirked and pointed at Yunsol, declaring that he chose him. Chan Wongang immediately tried to intervene, beginning to protest that Yunsol had only just completed the elementary chamber. However, Byok Hansung quickly interrupted him, reminding him that he had been told he could choose anyone. Irritation flickered across Chan Wonggang's face, and he muttered under his breath about the fool's arrogance. Speaking louder, he demanded what sense there was in testing one's sword against someone who had barely completed the elementary chamber. He urged Byok Hansung to select someone else. Before the situation could be settled, Yunsol interjected. He said that he had no problem with the duel. Chan Wongang turned on him in shock, exclaiming at his audacity. Yunsol stood up and explained himself. He stated that he had learned swordsmanship under instructor Jin Gak of the elementary trial. If he tested his skills against others, he believed he would be able to improve at a faster pace. Chan Wongang narrowed his gaze. Inwardly, he judged that Yunsol was trying to protect his pride with skills only partially learned from the elementary chamber. After a heavy sigh, he finally pointed toward the wooden swords nearby and allowed the duel to proceed. He remarked that knowing one's own ability was itself an important skill for any martial artist, and expressed hope that Yunsol would prove himself capable enough to reach the advanced chamber. Meanwhile, Byok Hansung muttered to himself, still grinning with excitement. He considered it a stroke of luck. In a chamber filled with talented geniuses, it would have been difficult to make himself stand out. But if he killed this latecomer, he would be able to solidify his own position. The two faced one another in the center and bowed in the traditional manner before combat. But Byok Hansung then sneered and announced aloud that Yunsol had guts. But guts alone were never enough to survive in the world of Murim. Chan Wongang raised his voice and gave the signal to begin. Byok Hansung moved first. In an instant, he lunged forward, swinging his sword in a horizontal slash. Yunsol ducked low to avoid the attack, closely observing his opponent's movements. Byok Hansung immediately followed with another strike, laughing loudly as he shouted that it was not a bad attempt. Yunsol firmly blocked the attack, steady on his feet. Byok Hansung felt the sensation of their swords clashing, and muttered to himself with a sneer that the boy really was a beginner. His grin widened as he declared he would demonstrate the Fire Rain Thundering Sword. He unleashed the technique, laughing as he struck again and again. However, his laughter slowly began to falter when he noticed that Yunsol was evading smoothly. Each time, Yunsol stepped aside with calm precision. Inside his own thoughts, Yunsol analyzed his opponent. He realized that Byok Hansung was performing the forms correctly, and that he truly was putting the Fire Rain Thundering Sword into practice. Chan Wongang observed the duel carefully. He noted that Byok Hansung's sword lacked depth, while Yunsol was not dodging through speed but rather through prediction. His movements seemed as though he already knew what would come next. The instructor's eyes narrowed in disbelief as he wondered if Yunsol could truly have learned the Wild Beast Path, but that was supposed to be impossible. The Wild Beast Path was known as the foundational martial art of the Wander Beast Pavilion, and even veteran masters struggled to learn it. For a boy to master it in only 2 weeks seemed absurd. Chan Wongang stomped his foot in frustration and shouted that only dodging made it difficult to judge. He reminded Yunsol that this duel was not to test reflexes but to measure swordsmanship. Hearing this, Yunsol stopped avoiding and shifted into offense. His blade moved, and the gathered participants gasped in shock. They recognized the form and muttered among themselves that he was performing the Fire Rain 13 forms. Byok Hansung scoffed at the sight and dismissed the attempt. He said that it was nothing more than the Fire Rain 13 forms. Among the onlookers, one of the participants watched closely. Her eyes widened, and she realized something. She thought to herself that Yunsol's execution was subtly different from the ordinary forms. Byok Hansung laughed confidently, said he could dodge such attacks with his eyes closed. But his grin faltered when Yunsol's strike grazed him, slicing off strands of his hair. He stiffened, his eyes widening in disbelief. Inside, he thought that this was not an imitation but the true fire rain 13 forms. As the exchange continued, Byok Hansung began to struggle, blocking desperately against Yunsol's onslaught. He gritted his teeth and muttered to himself in frustration, wondering if Yunsol had intentionally used a distorted variation earlier to mock him. Perhaps, he thought bitterly, Yunsol was doing this only to catch the attention of the instructor and advance directly to the advanced chamber. In his desperation, Byok Hansung's fury exploded. He roared that he would be the one to rise to the advanced chamber and unleashed a vicious strike, crying out the name of the Asura sword sect's lethal move, blood-shattering strike. Chan Wonggang's eyes widened from the sidelines. He recognized the forbidden technique instantly, and admitted inwardly that he had never forbidden them from using other sword styles. Still, he was astonished to see such a deadly art brought into the duel, yet his attention quickly returned to Yunsol. What truly startled him was that even in the face of such overwhelming pressure, the boy's footwork and stance did not falter. His balance remained unshaken. The thought struck him sharply. Perhaps this child truly had managed to learn the wild beast path. On the battlefield, Byok Hansung shouted again in frustration, calling Yunsol a brat who only knew how to dodge. He vowed that this would be the end. He leapt high into the air and unleashed another fearsome move, Bloody Wind Warding Moon. Chan Wonggang's eyes widened again and he realized the sheer danger of the incoming attack. But at that critical moment, Yunsol moved swiftly. He blocked the assault and immediately turned, flowing seamlessly into his counter. The chamber erupted in gasps of shock as he performed the Fire Rain 13 form's final technique. His sword pierced forward with Infinite and Boundless, the 13th form, driving directly into Byok Hansung's chest. Blood burst from Byok Hansung's mouth as his eyes widened in disbelief. His body collapsed to the ground with a heavy thud. Yunsol lowered his sword and stood silently, staring down at his fallen opponent. The other participants recoiled in shock. Their voices trembled as one of them cried out loudly, declaring in horror that Byok Hansung had died. Chan Wongang slowly approached Byok Hansung's fallen body, while Yunsol set the wooden sword aside. Standing over the corpse, the instructor lowered his gaze and thought grimly to himself that the young man was dead, struck precisely in a vital spot. He then turned his eyes toward Yunsol and asked whether he had always been a disciple of the Wandering Beast Pavilion. Yunsol shook his head and answered that he had not. Wongang pressed further, demanding to know if Yunsol was claiming to have perfectly mastered the wild beast path in just 2 weeks. Yunsol calmly replied that he had only learned the basics. At this, Wongang scoffed and accused him of lying, remarking bitterly that perhaps the Wandering Beast Pavilion now taught its disciples deceit as well. As Yunsol began to respond, Wongang cut him off. Glancing once more at Byok Hansung's corpse, he told him that he had no need for excuses and ordered him to clean up the mess immediately. The other participants erupted in protest. They cried out that committing murder during a normal sparring session was absurd, and they questioned whether Yunsol should be punished for such an act. Wonggang's tone shifted sharply as he fixed them with a hard glare. He told them not to be mistaken. Just because the place was called a martial chamber did not mean it was truly one. This, he reminded them coldly, was Hell Island. If one used a killing technique, then one had to be prepared to die in return. With that, he announced that the trial would resume. After a while, the participants paired off and began dueling once again. When the matches concluded, those who had lost gathered together before Wongang. He told them flatly that they had failed the trial and ordered them to leave immediately to seek another martial chamber to train in. One of the defeated participants hesitated and pleaded, stammering that it had only been a single test and asked whether they could not be given another chance. Wongang denied the request without hesitation. He explained that they had likely passed the beginning trials because they were physically fit, but to earn the Fire Rain sword required more than fitness. It demanded potential, talent, and the willingness to endure blood, sweat, and tears in order to surpass one's own limits. They had failed because they lacked those qualities. Turning his back to them, he dismissed them harshly, telling them to get out. Once the group left, Wongang noticed that someone remained behind. Yunsol still stood in the chamber. The two locked eyes in silence until Wongang finally asked why he had not left. Yun-Sol responded by asking if he was required to leave as well. Wang Gang told him that he had won his duel and passed the trial, so he should proceed to the advanced trial. Yun-Sol, however, insisted that he wished to remain in the intermediate chamber, stating that he wanted to advance further but preferred to stay where he was. Wang Gang paused for a moment before questioning why. Yun-Sol explained that the only sword technique he had learned so far was the Fire Rain 13 forms, and that he had yet to learn anything from the intermediate chamber. Wang Gang frowned and challenged his statement, pointing out that Yun-Sol had already learned the Wild Beast Path, and had even seen through the techniques of the Asura sword sect, yet he still claimed he had learned nothing. Yun-Sol affirmed this without hesitation. Wang Gang scoffed softly and then accepted his decision. He said he would teach him the Fire Rain Thundering Sword. 13 forms. However, his expression hardened as he added a warning. He told Yun-Sol that he despised those who played little tricks in order to make an impression. If he discovered that Yun-Sol had secretly learned any other sword techniques apart from the Fire Rain 13 forms, he would not hesitate to behead him immediately. 4 days later, Wang Gang observed Yun-Sol practicing the sword technique. His strikes were sharp, his movements focused. The instructor thought silently to himself, marveling at the boy's growth. Over the past 4 days he had examined him in every possible way, and he had confirmed that Yun-Sol truly had no fundamental training in swordsmanship before this. He really was a complete novice who had just begun to learn. Yet his determination and concentration were remarkable. It was as though his very life depended on mastering martial arts. Smirking faintly, Wang Gang admitted inwardly that he now understood how Yun-Sol had been able to master the Wild Beast Path in just 2 weeks. At that moment, Yun-Sol performed the Fire Rain Thundering Sword, Extreme Lightning. Wang Gang raised his hand and commanded him to stop. He stepped forward and told him he could stop now, for it seemed that he had already grasped the principles of the Fire Rain Thundering Sword. Yun-Sol, breathing heavily, looked surprised and tried to speak, but Wang Gang cut him off. He explained that the Fire Rain Thundering Sword was a technique that twisted the body quickly so that the moves could be connected in sequence. All of its forms involved swinging the sword around oneself, making it ineffective in real combat. Yet Yun-Sol was attempting to wield it as if he were truly in a fight, using it with intent to kill. Catching his breath, Yun-Sol asked whether that was not the true point of sword techniques. Wang Gang answered firmly that murderous intent was indeed necessary for demonic martial arts, but in order to ascend to a higher realm of martial prowess, the Fire Rain sword also required the aspect of killing. He placed his finger against Yun-Sol's forehead and warned him that if he could not rid himself of the murderous intent in his mind, then his martial arts would eventually harm him instead of strengthening him. Yun-Sol touched his forehead and thought back to what instructor Jin Gak had once told him. The words were nearly identical. Wang Gang continued, speaking of his own past. He admitted that he too had lived with murderous intent in his heart, cutting down all who stood in his way. Because of that, he had lost both honor and pride, and in turn, his martial prowess had fallen. He reflected that while techniques designed to kill might feel as though they could elevate one's martial level, they were in truth obstacles on the endless path of swordsmanship. He told Yun-Sol bluntly that he needed to abandon his murderous intent. Yun-Sol listened and suddenly recalled his grandfather's words from when he was still a child. His grandfather had once told him that those who wielded the sword carried a past stained with despair and misfortune, which was why warriors of Murim hated to speak of their pasts. Remembering this, Yun-Sol asked Wang Gang why he was telling him such things. Wang Gang paused for a moment, before answering that he had already said why. He too had once lived with murder in his heart. The instructor then asked Yun-Sol for his name. Yun-Sol gave it, stating that he was Bu Yun-Sol. Wang Gang let out a scoff and recalled that he had heard the name before. So this was the boy who had survived the second trial, the same one Jin Gak had mentioned. He warned him that he had a serious problem. Alarmed, Yun-Sol asked what it was. Wang Gang explained that he lacked the basic foundation of martial arts. His competitors had been learning since childhood, and if he tried to learn the Fire Rain sword in the advanced chamber without a foundation, the gap between them would only widen. He needed to master the basics quickly so that he could build upon them. Wang Gang declared that from now on he would teach him the unrivaled lightning and thunder, a technique of his own creation. However, he gave a stern warning. In the process of trying to master this art, he had destroyed the nerve endings in his own fingers, rendering them useless. That was how dangerous the technique was. If Yun-Sol failed, he might lose control over his entire arms, not move on to the advanced chamber, and end up crippled instead. He asked whether Yun-Sol was prepared for that risk. Yun-Sol's thoughts lingered on the possibility of losing his arms, but he did not hesitate. He bowed firmly and thanked him. Then, With a quiet determination, he muttered that for the sake of revenge, he was willing to give up even his soul. After a month had passed, Yunsol finally advanced to the chamber beyond the intermediate stage. As he walked toward the entrance, he reflected silently to himself. It had taken him an entire month to learn the unrivaled lightning and thunder and leave the intermediate chamber behind. Although his instructor had said that his progress was fast, he still felt that it had taken longer than he had expected. After first mastering the basic martial arts of the elementary chamber and then the sword techniques of the intermediate chamber, he thought that it was now time to proceed further. When Yunsol opened the heavy doors of the advanced chamber, all heads turned toward him. At the front of the hall, the old instructor fixed him with a sharp glare. Yunsol paused for a moment, observing the aura within the room. He muttered softly to himself that the advanced chamber truly carried a different energy. The atmosphere was far fiercer, and within the eyes of the trainees, he sensed a predatory focus. Nobody looked at him with disdain any longer. He realized it must have been because he had killed Byuk Hansung. The thought made him reflect bitterly. Cleaning a corpse was considered a lowly task, yet killing a man with a sword was something others praised. Breaking his thoughts, the instructor spoke. With a warm smile, he addressed Yunsol, acknowledging him as the fiery soul he had heard of. He told him that he had been just about to begin the lesson and instructed Yunsol to sit. As Yunsol moved to take a place on the floor, the instructor began speaking once more, explaining for the sake of the new trainee the central teachings of the Fire Rain Sword along with the 7 principles. Power, he explained, must be distributed evenly throughout the entire body. One must strive for balance. He instructed the students to pull in their chest and push out their back. He warned them not to place all of their energy into a single strike. As Yunsol listened closely, he realized within his thoughts that he would not have been able to understand this lecture if he had not already learned the advanced martial arts of the intermediate chamber. When the instructor concluded his lecture, he ended the verbal teachings for the day. He then called out to Yunsol by name and told him to follow. Together, the two left the hall. As they walked outside, the instructor touched the leaves of the trees along the path. He spoke calmly, explaining that there existed a realm where one without a sword could defeat one who carried one. To be more exact, he said that such a person no longer needed a sword in order to form sword arts. He then plucked a branch from a nearby tree. Without warning, he swung it at Yunsol, stopping just an inch from his face. His expression hardened into a grim look as he asked a question. If Yunsol were to be attacked suddenly, just like now, yet lacked a sword, how would he respond with sword martial arts? Yunsol stood stunned at the unexpected action. The instructor continued his explanation. While Yunsol had been training in the intermediate chamber, the trainees in the advanced chamber had already learned the Shining Mystique, the first form of the Fire Rain Sword, and were now discussing its theories. If Yunsol could not understand his question, then he would not teach him further. He warned Yunsol to answer carefully. After taking a moment to steady himself, Yunsol closed his eyes in deep thought. Finally, he opened them wide and lunged forward, declaring his answer. If there was no sword in his hand, then he would use his opponent's sword. As his hand reached for the branch, the instructor sidestepped effortlessly. Yunsol froze in shock and confusion, unable to comprehend when the instructor had moved behind him. The instructor told him that his choice had been too hasty. Gritting his teeth, Yunsol turned. Stunned by the man's speed, he leapt forward again, trying to seize the branch, but once more the instructor dodged easily. Yunsol thought in frustration that he could not even predict the man's movements. He had not expected to succeed in catching the branch, but the fact that he could not follow the instructor's movements at all was humiliating. He told himself that if he could not impress the instructor here, he would not be allowed to remain in the advanced chamber. Determined, he decided to push the wild beast path to its limits, heightening his senses completely so that he could read the flow of direction. Once more, Yunsol spun and lunged with everything he had, his sharpened senses guiding him. Even if it was only once, he swore he would seize the branch. But just as he closed in and his hand reached for it, the instructor released a powerful surge of chi. The force blasted Yunsol backward through the air. He crashed hard to the ground. As he struggled to rise, the instructor approached him, placed a hand firmly on his shoulder, and let out a booming laugh of satisfaction. He declared that Yunsol had passed. Confused, Yunsol muttered to himself, wondering how he could have passed when he had not even touched the branch. The instructor simply told him that he would begin learning the Shining Mystique starting the next day, and ordered him to come early in the morning, earlier than the others. Yoon-sol stood, bowed deeply, and answered with determination that he understood. As Yoon-sol walked away, the instructor looked down at the branch in his hand. The leaves slowly began to fall from it. His gaze turned cold as he remarked that even a cub was still a wolf. He then chuckled softly and said he had high expectations for Yoon-sol. Later, as Yoon-sol made his way through the forest, he muttered that his lesson for the day was over. He debated whether to rest or to circulate his chi. Perhaps, he thought, he should explore Hell Island further. He reminded himself that after what had happened during the second trial, no one could predict when a fight might break out here. Suddenly, he froze. From behind him, he felt multiple presences. He quickly counted in his mind. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. A group of participants stepped out. One of them sneered, telling Yoon-sol that he had been acting out of place ever since the intermediate chamber, and that they would teach him a lesson. Another added with a grin that since Yoon-sol had been the first to kill someone, he should not blame them for what was about to happen. A third spoke up, boasting that the 5 of them were known as the 5-peak swords, geniuses among geniuses, and that he had better prepare himself. Yoon-sol narrowed his eyes, muttering to himself that they were wrong. There was one more presence. He shifted into his stance, readying himself for battle. One of the trainees shouted angrily, demanding to know if Yoon-sol truly intended to fight them. Before he could finish speaking, a sharp blow struck the back of his head. The man collapsed to the ground instantly. The remaining participants turned in shock. Their eyes widened in horror as they recognized the figure standing behind them. Their voices trembled as they cried out her name, Seo Jinha.